Donna's going to talk a little bit about Prop 8, what it says, and what its effects would be, and then I'll talk about the campaign to winning and how you can all engage to have us all wake up on November 5th facing the kind of world that we want to be facing.
So I want to echo Kate's thoughts about this being a historical civil rights moment, but what I believe is that we are going to look back at this moment and remember that we came together as a coalition, not just so that everyone can stand side by side with the LGBT community to protect their rights, but because we all understood that Proposition 8 posed a threat to all of us, that our interests are all inextricably intertwined. And what I mean by that is this is a constitutional change. And I am offended and concerned about this, not just as a lesbian, but as a woman and as an Asian American. And so we have our work cut out for us, and we'll say more about that. There's lots of reasons why we're all here. There's lots of reasons why all our communities need to be really galvanized and watchful, because this is a very dangerous precedent for a lot of reasons. And let me back up and talk just a moment about what our goals are here today. One, as Mary said, is to arm you with all the information you need about the legal background, about the proposition, and about the campaign specifics, the No on 8 campaign. We also want to share with you to become effective advocates, sort of how you can talk about this effectively within your communities. And one thing I want to say about that, just right at the outset, is I'd like you to think about attending to your audience. Okay, here's what I mean by this. Can I see a show of hands? Is there anybody in this room that is not a lawyer? Yay! Okay. Is there everybody in this room, are you expecting to talk about Prop 8 to people who are not lawyers? Yeah, I would imagine so. Okay. So lawyers, let me just tell you that we are not normal. I have experience with this because I teach in a law school. I'll tell you, even after 1 year, their families and the law students are like, what are you talking about? And it's not just legal language, it's also, we really geek out over certain analysis and points that normal people don't really get that excited about. So you need to think about your audience. If you're talking to lawyers, by all means, go to town on some of the legal issues. But we're hoping that you're going to reach beyond that. Not to say that non-lawyers are less smart, less sophisticated, less in tune with the messages. It's just they hear things differently. Let me give you the NCLR board as an example. We have lawyers and non-lawyers. When we get the training on what's going on with Proposition 8, my lawyer sisters, we're all, wow, that's so exciting. And the other ones are kind of like, this other thing really spoke to me. So consider your audience and in delivering your message. Okay, we also are going to have you leave here with specific ideas about how to put your thoughts into action, because this training is only good if it gets on the ground immediately. And I think, is it 55 days?
54 now.
Okay, 54 days. So not a lot of time. We really need to get this on the road. So finally, we want to make sure that we answer all your questions. So please ask your questions as we go along. We'll facilitate that. If there's things that we might say, park that thought, we're about to get to that, or we might just take it as it comes up. But we believe it's going to be most helpful and useful to everyone if we just engage in a little discussion as questions pop in your mind. Okay, so Proposition 8. Here we go. This is the 14 words that we're dealing with. Only marriage, have you got it on there? Okay. Only marriage between a man and a woman is valid or recognized in California. So what are the effects if this passes? Well, specifically, it's going to, quote, eliminate the fundamental right to marry for lesbians and gay men. It's really important language because the other side is talking about preserving marriage. And it was a big fight and a successful fight to get the ballot materials say eliminate the right to marry. People, Californians, however they think about the issue of sexual orientation, don't like to think about eliminating people's rights. So that's a very, very powerful message, and one that you'll hear a few times as we go through this. I think more universally, it sets a really dangerous precedent because it turns equal protection on its head. Remember, we're talking about a constitutional amendment. And suddenly we have our Constitution singling out one group of people, namely lesbian and gay men, and treating them differently. Okay, that's really different from the way that our system of government works. And here, I need to give a proviso to the lawyers. Again, the focus groups have been showing that people don't like to hear about the courts. They don't want to hear about how this is overturning the courts or preserving the courts. And that's because people think in sound bites sometimes. But if you get beyond the sound bite, here's what the rationale is, and here's how one might explain this. Okay, so if the majority of Californians really think that gay men and lesbians shouldn't be able to marry, then why isn't that just fine? Why can't we just vote on it? Well, the reason is because in our system of government, in our Constitution, we have this thing called the equal protection of the laws. That means we believe that our laws ought to apply the same to everybody, unless there's a really good reason. So we also give judges the power to enforce equal protection, to make that a guarantee for everyone. We just don't say, let's all have a majority, let's see what the majority thinks about this. We rest it with judges. Why? Because sometimes the majority gets it wrong. So here's an example from history that's really important to think about. I'm going to tell you about the Perez versus Sharp case, which was in 1948 decided by the California Supreme Court. And in that case, the plaintiffs were an interracial couple, and they were challenging the law at the time in California that said, well, whites cannot marry Negroes, mulattoes, Mongolians, and members of the Malay race. Okay? So it was the court's job to say, okay, well, let's hear your arguments, and let's sort out what is fact. Is there a real social ill here, or is this really about fear? And they looked at the arguments. The arguments at that time were, well, Caucasians are less susceptible to some diseases like tuberculosis, or certain races are inferior, or this is right out of the decision, or the children of interracial marriages are inferior, sickly, effeminate, and social pariahs. Okay, court obviously sorted that out and figured out, that it was unconstitutional. And those ideas, those arguments really shocked us today, but at the time, it was a hot social debate. The courts had to make that decision. So we don't want it to be that, we rest that power in the courts, but then now we're going to say, well, what does everybody else think? Let's take a vote. That goes absolutely contrary to what equal protection is all about. There's a reason why judges make those decisions. It's long-winded, and I told you you can't really explain that in a soundbite, but it is important. It's why it's not just about the LGBT community. It's about equal protection and equality for any protected group. Everybody is vulnerable if we have this dangerous foothold in the Constitution that is presented by Proposition 8. Okay, so.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you really get that far in the conversation with people? I mean, and I'm not talking about a soundbite, but would it not be better to give them something more real life? Because by the time you get to Perez, and you start to sound like a lawyer.
You're absolutely right.
As opposed to saying that means the majority could say that, I don't know, something that maybe touches their lives. The majority could say that blacks are no longer equal, or something like that. Or,
Bobby, I think you're really right that it's going to depend on your audience. And if you are talking to, a community of color, there's ways that you get right down to it and explain it in a much shorter, because they know. They know they can really put themselves in those shoes. I think with other people, you might need to talk a little bit more about, how this fits into the way that we govern ourselves.
So you're not suggesting the whole thing vote?
No. And we're going to get to punchier things. I think the other pieces of Prop 8 and the arguments that the other side is making is much more susceptible to punchy, good, short, sound bites, if you will. This one is harder. This one's harder for sure. Okay, so.